but also about romanticism being this like really revolutionary era too, right? And that's sort of what we need right now, instead of small incremental change, which is sort of an easier way of coping and thinking that you're doing something. We actually need this like large scale, immediate change. So Todd, I think you talk about that a bit more too. And yeah, for now, would you think, so would you agree that it's less on us than it is on like the big industries and governments to actually do the work?
Yes, of course. This is, I mean, there's so many things I can say. I mean, to back up a little bit, you know, I'm working on some lectures right now, and I've come to this kind of weird moment, which is not normal for me, because I'm basically, my background is I'm an anti-humanist, which means I'm really a post-structuralist. That's my background. And so it would make sense that somebody like me would be interested in the movements of post-humanism, which for my money are just basically very post-structural in their inspiration. But I've come to this idea that humanism is what has done this to us, for sure. As an anti-humanist, that makes perfect sense to me. Humanism has caused this problem, along with what we could call Enlightenment reason. But moving forward, the question is, what do we need more of? We mentioned empathy before, and I agree with that. But I'm coming around more to a position that I would be surprised with myself 10 years ago, which is I think we need more reason, maybe more humanism than ever before, because we've done this to the planet. And now the question is, what are we going to do with the planet now that we have become its very conscious stewards? Now that we've done it, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage this situation? And I see this as, we've really done it now. The planet, you can't turn it back. We've got to manage it or curate the situation somehow. So it requires more reason than ever, which must place human beings at the center of all calculations, but also other beings as well, like animals and things. We cannot not put ourselves at the center, because it's about the preservation of civilization itself and life as we know it. So it's a real funny moment where you have an anti-humanist like myself arguing for possibly the necessity of doubling down on reason, which is, in fact, I spent my entire career critiquing. But I don't see any way around that, except for that, I think, to say that reason moving forward has to be something different than the reason that got us here in the first place. But it still must be reason of some kind. It must be a reason infused with something like empathy for the other. It can't just be business as usual. It still must be based in the tradition of self-critique, which is the best aspect of philosophy historically, but sometimes gets lost. So just to cause trouble for our discussion, this is kind of where I am these days. So I don't see us moving towards romanticism per se. I see romanticism as a necessary stage in the history of the evolution of time since the Enlightenment. And I see that there's a lot of romantic elements that are necessary to appeal to in some ways, but somehow we have to go forward with something that is new, but's built out of the garbage of the past. And among the garbage of the past includes things that are really important, like the ability to do the powerful things that technology and science and reason has been able to do, even though that's exactly what's caused us to get here in the first place. So I'm not going to say that we need to get rid of reason. What would that mean? So that's my troublesome admission here, that it's something that I'm struggling with a little bit.
It is a lot to struggle with. I'm sorry, go ahead, Caroline. I was just going to say, actually, to connect it to you, just the idea of cultivating empathy and the role that reading and writing can play in sort of dealing with climate grief and all of this. But yeah, I'll respond in any way you want.
Well, I just wanted to, I'm just thinking that talking about disciplinary boundaries and the way we might critique our colleagues in the social sciences and humanities for being really stuck in their disciplinary mindsets. And to an extent, we're doing the same thing in this conversation, because we're thinking about, we're talking about romanticism and humanism and reason. And that's such a Western way to think about it. And I have some colleagues in New Zealand, who are really very much involved with the regenerative cultures movement, if you know about that, which is thinking about different ways to imagine civilization, taking it for granted that the climate is collapsing and that we are past the point of conservation, and now we have to think about regeneration. And very central to that movement is the role of Indigenous wisdom, and which is something that's just been so pushed to the margins of my own intellectual training, as well as, you know, most of what I have read and what we even see in journalism. But that's one of the things that's been exciting about about the environmental movement now, especially the youth involvement, is that it is bringing in those Indigenous voices and that Indigenous wisdom, which might be that connection between reason and also something that is not reason as we understand it in Western thought, something that is more intuitive, empathetic, that emphasizes connectivity, fluidity. I think that's a really exciting strand of thinking that we need more of.
I would say, and this would be give a link back to Bryn as well. I'm interested in something that I haven't read a lot about, which is mirror neurons, what you guys are interested in, but also the work of Jeremy Rifkin, who I'm not by no means an expert, but he wrote a popular book in which I think it's called The Empathic Civilization, and his kind of argument is that we begin with smaller groups of people that we identify with, and slowly moving up to the nation state, we eventually move to bigger and bigger groups through our technologies and so on. And it makes possible the idea that not only identifying myself as, say, for example, a Canadian, but as maybe a member of the human species, that this is possible, that the next natural evolution of consciousness would be this big empathic civilization. I sure hope that's true. I like what he's saying. It makes sense with what I've argued in Democracy of Suffering. And it's very optimistic about the possibility that we can find a way out, which would be different than the world we've lived in before. At the same time, I'm still trying to find a bridge from here to there. And you're right. Of course, I'm completely thinking of this in terms of Western thought, for sure. And I take your point. It's a good point. How can we think in ways that are different and contrary to or critical of the philosophic tradition of which we are the lucky recipients, basically.
Yeah, lucky recipients, but we have been so just steeped in certain assumptions about how knowledge is made that and then that's one of the challenges that I guess we have if we want to be scholar activists. One of the things we have to start with is just being more critical of our own thought process. Yeah. Yep.
Fair enough. Bryn.
Oh, yeah, we're actually, so I love that on Indigenous knowledge. So we're reading Eden Robinson's Son of a Trickster in my class right now. So we're doing a big section on Indigenous knowledge. And so obviously the idea that, so their care for the environment, but also their novels always, and actually their culture, they have that trickster figure, And so I've been noticing how relevant the trickster figure is right now. So it's this idea of breaking boundaries and showing people new perspectives and encouraging new patterns of thought. So it's this sort of really, and it's really sort of, it's comedic at the same time, but then it's dark at the same time. So it really fits with our times right now. So, and again, that Indigenous knowledge just comes through the entire novel too. And the idea that care for the planet means care for ourselves. And then also this idea from Satish Kumar that we can't have social justice without environmental justice. So the idea that they're both intimately tied too.
I would say the trickster image, it's a good one. I mean, and I always return to it in my own classes. That's why at the end of my philosophy intro classes, I almost always teach Russell Brand. And I sometimes like on my exams to give a question, could Russell Brand be considered the Socrates of our time? Because what would a trickster look like? Socrates was a gadfly, right? He wasn't exactly a comic or a trickster, so it's not exactly that. He wasn't a comic figure. But how do you reach people today in a way that changes their minds about things? And so I agree with you that Indigenous view of the trickster is also embodied in our own Western culture through people that are on the outside of it with comedians. I'm amazed at how much comedians have done for our political dialogue in the last 10, 12, 15 years. It's amazing and weird. And also at the same line, things we were talking about scholars before, I also look to journalists in a way that previous generations of scholars never would. Yeah. It's not just the first draft of history. We don't have time to wait 50 years for history to unfold. The first draft of history, which journalists are covering, is more important than most of the books that I read. I can read Monbiot or Naomi Klein or Chris Hedges, or these people are doing stuff and writing stuff now that I need to read and I need to respond to today. And that's so there's not only tricksters, but journalists, and maybe there's some slight connection there between that as well, and social media and doing things quite different than what we've done in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk a bit about like the sort of different forms of media in the chapter too, and the idea that sort of digital is now more immediate and necessary given the pace of culture. Do you want to say more about that, or whatever else you were going to say?
Sure. Yeah, and well, we talked about some of these same authors and about the role of journalism being much more immediate. Some of the many critiques that I have of academic discourse is that it's just ordinary people just can't get it. And I mean, like they might not have the intellectual training that we all have to speak in more elevated and abstract terms, but they literally cannot get it because our academic stuff is paywalled, it's expensive, it's you have to know how to use a database or be able to get a desk copy from a publisher if you don't want to spend $100 for the book or whatever. And social media and good journalistic coverage is accessible to people. And so that is where not just information, but I think really importantly, really important argumentation and exhortation is happening. Someone like John Oliver, he does really good research. He's got this whole staff of researchers and he lays out his argument really unsparingly and uses comedy to do that, which I think is amazing. I'm also a big fan of Monbiot and the other journalists who are featured in The Guardian or the New Yorker magazine. Things like that. So like the importance of non-specialist, non-expert voices or self-taught experts or experts who are experts. They know what they're talking about. They just don't have the credentials for it. So as Todd was saying, it's like we just don't have time for that anymore. So I was reading up on Todd's work before this interview by reading the interview that you two did in Epilogue, and you were talking about COVID and the way in which that the pandemic may have given many people a chance to really forcibly step back from the rat race, the mindlessness of the rat race in a way that might invite some reflection and reevaluation. Earlier in the pandemic, that seemed like there was more potential for that because everything had just ground to such a halt. Now, because we are so committed to opening back up again, things are starting to become a little bit more hectic. But I think that I am hopeful that COVID has given us an opportunity for that really drastic reassessment. And not everyone wants to do that intellectual and emotional work, but I hope that many people have or will. As we all know, like climate change is going to force that confrontation sooner, if not later. But COVID has, I think, given many people a chance to do that in a way within the safety of our own homes in a safer space. And so I'm just optimistic that this will help catalyze some of this change in consciousness and change in behavior that we really need. That's it.
I agree. I just wrote an article that I'll send along to the both of you in a minute about COVID and climate change. And I think, I agree with what you're saying. There's something about this unexpected event, although it's been, predicted to come at some point. But there's something about this event happening, and more specifically, how amazing people have been in allowing themselves to be, at least for a certain period, shut down for the benefit of others. A kind of agreement to suspend the norms of capitalism while this is happening. Although our governments, especially say the American government in particular, using this as an opportunity to basically give a lot of money to the elites in any case. But I think that in a lot of countries, it's kind of a little mini prelude towards something that you could call socialism, whereby we can think about universal basic income and how, what's going to happen when our economies collapse because of climate change, which they will in certain ways for sure. How are we going to look after the people in industries that are wiped out or otherwise destroyed for various reasons that are not their own faults, right? We now can imagine that people are poor not on their own fault. Now, there's always an assumption that people are poor because they did decisions in life and that we are smarter and wiser. But the beauty about the democracy of suffering is that we're all going to suffer in these ways and lose our jobs potentially. Things are going to shut down, and we're going to need government assistance in a way that is unusual. So I agree with you. I think that COVID and the response to it, both at the level of many governments and the people especially, has been really amazing and encouraging. Because there will be this, I don't believe this was a climate change event, but there will be a climate change pandemic in the near future. And that will be much worse than COVID. And this has given us an opportunity to see how things can be done more quickly. We can shut the economy down, the economies down, and we can live differently. Other than hoarding stuff. And I mean, we can help each other. People do amazing things under conditions of a crisis, right? This is one of the reasons I really like Rebecca Solnit's work on crisis. People in a crisis are actually amazingly good. They're not bad. People don't riot. This is a myth or a fantasy of the elites. Well, really what's happening is that the elites are worried that we're going to do things differently. Well, I think we're going to have to do things differently. And when I look after my neighbors when we're under COVID, this is just a harbinger of a different way of living in the world, where maybe we have less individually, but we have more collectively because we have empathy for our neighbors, literally. And I think people are, going back to our earliest discussion, inclined towards altruism and helping others and collectivities and not competition and individualism. I think people are much better than we've given them credit for in the last 50, 80, 100 years of neoliberalism. And I think that COVID has shown us that. So I'm glad you mentioned it, because we forgot to talk about COVID to this moment. So thank you.
How could we forget? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an opportunity just for a total restart, eh? Like, instead of just trying to fix old things, just start new when we almost don't even have a choice. I really like that. So then you have hope there.